Hello. I'd like first of all to thank all of those people who have bought me a coffee or purchased my books or simply left a comment on my channel in appreciation of the work I do here. It's enormously helpful and I'm very grateful to you for it, so thank you very much for that. The case of the murder of Betty Williams in 1961 is very interesting. There's no dispute concerning any of the facts or events leading up to her death, only the interpretation of them. The circumstances of the murder are so unusual that it's difficult to understand the psychological throes which led to the tragedy. Here's my best effort to understand why a 17-year-old girl with everything apparently to live for was murdered on the 22nd of March 1961, and why a 17-year-old boy got away with her murder. At 8:45 on the morning of the 22nd of March 1961, police in Odessa, Texas, received a phone call from Mrs. Mary Williams saying her 17-year-old daughter, Betty, was missing from her home. Betty had not come down for breakfast that morning, and as she was in the habit of sneaking out of her house at night sometimes, it was presumed that she had done so on the previous evening and had not returned. Mrs. Williams had already called her school, but found Betty was not there either. Police took the report seriously, and they visited Odessa High School that afternoon, and in the principal's office they interviewed students, one by one, to see if they had any information concerning Betty's whereabouts. A boy called Ike Nail said he had driven Betty home from a school play rehearsal on the previous evening, and she had suggested he meet her in the alley behind her house half an hour later. He did. Ike returned at 10:30, and Betty came out to his car wearing pink pajamas and a duster, a kind of light dressing gown or robe. At around midnight a car approached with its headlights on, and Betty had said, "Oh my God, I didn't think he'd come." Apparently it was a former boyfriend of Betty's and a boy known to Ike, called Mack Herring, who attended the same school as both. Betty got out of Ike Nail's car, and her last words to him were, "I've got to call his bluff, even if he kills me." Ike then saw Betty climb into Mack Herring's jeep, and the couple had left. Officer Bobby McAlpine interviewed Mack Herring in the principal's office. Mack said he had collected Betty shortly before midnight. They spent some time talking, after which he had dropped Betty off at her parents' house around midnight, and then left. He had not seen her since then. Officer McAlpine inquired whether Mack had dropped her at the front or back door. "The front door," he said. "Did you see her enter the house?" "No," Mack told him. He had left before she did so. Now, according to Ike Nail, Betty had been wearing her bedclothes when she had got into Mack's jeep. It seemed strange to McAlpine to learn she had been dropped at her front porch dressed in this manner. What would her parents say at her entering the house so openly at midnight in her pajamas? His suspicions roused, McAlpine took Mack Herring to Odessa police station, and here he was subjected to formal police questions concerning the matter. 45 minutes later, with discrepancies mounting in his account, and under increasing pressure, Mack Herring made a confession. He told officers that Betty had been asking him to kill her, and so he had taken a 12-gauge shotgun and obliged her. He said that he had killed her near to his father's hunting lease, 26 miles north of Odessa, and that Betty had selected the gun to be used in killing her. Betty Williams was born Elizabeth Jean Williams in Odessa, Texas, on the 11th of August, 1943, the eldest of 4 children. Her father was a carpenter and building contractor who had been a farmer in Illinois for a time, but appears to have had a number of occupations, and her mother worked at J.C. Penney's, a department store in Odessa. They lived in the poorer part of town. They were religious folk, attended Baptist church, and Betty's paternal grandfather was a minister in Marion, Texas. Betty was an attractive girl, intelligent and outward-going, somewhat extrovert in character, perhaps as a result of her being deprived by comparison with other children at school. She held opinions very much at odds with those of her peers. She read Kerouac and Ginsberg, was adamantly opposed to segregation at a time when such views amongst many white Americans from that part of the U.S. were controversial. She was creative, too, an avid writer who wrote stories, kept a diary, and was a keen correspondent with others, readily sharing her progressive views on a variety of topics. According to her maternal grandfather, Jesse Soper, she had placed in the top 5 in a speech contest out of hundreds of students. She was a gifted actress, too, had major parts in the 3 school plays up until 1961, and had ambitions to be a Broadway actress. She seems to have cared little for convention, sometimes didn't wear a bra, and liked to shock people. In a town like Odessa in 1961, such a girl was shunned. Yet she seems to have done her best to court such notoriety. She was also widely regarded as being a girl of loose morals, and was reputed to have had sex with a number of boys. What nice Odessa girl would wish to be associated with her? For her part, Betty had contempt for the prim, proper girls who regarded themselves as her betters. Boys were attracted to her, but what decent Odessa boy would dare to be associated with her, even if they were interested? In public, at least, West Odessa, the nice part of town, kept her at arm's length. In spite of all this, she was bright, articulate, and knew how to express the ideas of the emerging 60s counterculture. She also had a strong sense of her own individualism. During the hot summer of 1960, she struck up a relationship with John Mack Herring. He was born in 1943 of a good family, and his father, a World War II veteran, had his own electrical contracting business. Mack, as he was called, was tall and clean-cut in appearance, in American school social terms, a jock, an athlete at the sharp end of the pyramid of school social strata. He played football, was academically competent, described as a normal student who achieved above-average grades by his teachers, and very, very quiet by his football coach. The relationship he enjoyed with Betty developed along clandestine lines, because presumably, whatever his feelings were towards Betty, Mack was not keen to parade these publicly. He was outside his caste, would be the subject of ribald boy talk. She was not the sort of girl he would wish to bring home to his parents, and he didn't. Mack Herring was, to an extent, not at the top of the social tree himself. He was good-looking, but not the handsomest, of good family, but not the best. He was intelligent, but not the cleverest. He played football, but was not one of the elite players. Such people, who occupy the periphery of their social circle, guard their positions jealously, because they are never assured. It was probably Mack's reluctance to be publicly associated with Betty, to treat her as his official girlfriend, which led her to try to make him jealous. She was an attractive girl with an unmistakable sexual allure, the sort of girl men are attracted to in spite of themselves. So she had little difficulty in attracting the attention of one of Mack Herring's friends, a boy called Bill Rose. He was a football player, a jock, of course, and he had been voted the most handsome in his class. To Betty he was a means to an end, of forcing Mack to acknowledge her by making him jealous. She parked with Bill Rose, to use that American vernacular of the period, which was used to describe the pre-sexual phase of teenage relationships. Whether this encounter was sexual in nature, Bill denied this later, we do not know. But Mack Herring found out, as he was intended to, and was angry and upset. If Betty had intended the effect of her betrayal to be for Mack to redouble his efforts with her, then she was to be disappointed. Mack rowed with her, called her names which he felt described her behaviour, and commenced a new relationship with a pretty red-headed girl called Sherry Martin. Betty's plan had backfired spectacularly. Rather than intensifying Mack's desire for her, it had precisely the opposite effect. She now missed Mack and longed for his company. She also felt thoroughly humiliated by this development. "I've never been so humiliated and torn to pieces as I am now," she wrote. "This is pure hell." It was the autumn of 1960. As Mack Herring paraded his new girlfriend, Betty was broken and had reached a low point in her life. That November, art seemed to imitate life for Betty, as Elvis Presley reached the top of the US 100 billboard with "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" She was. To add to her woes, for the first time in 3 years, the new drama teacher at school, Miss Enid Woodward, did not select her for a major part in the forthcoming school production of Winterset, a 1935 play by Maxwell Anderson. But she gave Mack a leading part, that of Troc Estella, a ruthless killer, a man without conscience. It may have been coincidental that she did so, or perhaps she sensed in him something of the character's psychopathic personality. For Betty Williams, the world seemed to be closing in on her in the winter of 1960-1961, and things got worse. Her father discovered her diary and learned of the extent of his daughter's activities with boys. He was appalled. Being a religious man, he prayed for her. Betty Williams, with fortune and the world seemingly against her, shunned at home and school, by her peers and most of all by the boy she loved, began to talk of suicide. To those about her it seemed quintessential Betty. She was seeking attention, seeking to shock, that's all. But she was also expressing the depth of her unhappiness. That is evident when she began to tell people she didn't have the nerve to kill herself, and asked others if they would do it for her. It was clearly a means of drawing people's attention to her apparent intention to commit suicide by involving others in her scheme. It was a ruse. "Will you do it for me?" she asked one. "No, I don't think so," said Maguire, thinking it was a joke. "I charge for my services," joked Jim Mercer in response to the same request. Mack Herring laughed it off too when she asked him. She was, surely, seeking to win Mack Herring back by all of this. It was a 17-year-old girl's attempt to declare her love and win his sympathy in one dramatic gesture. Mack gave her and another boy a lift home from school. In the car she asked him if she held the gun to her head, would he pull the trigger for her? He laughed, and so too did Betty apparently. The other boy in the car regarded it as a joke too. But Betty did something else. There and then she wrote a note exonerating Mack from any blame for her murder, should there be trouble afterwards. They were all apparently laughing at this. The letter read, March 20th, 1961. "I want everyone to know that what I am about to do in no way implicates anyone else. I say this to make sure that no blame falls on anyone other than myself. I have depressing problems that concern, for the most part, myself. I'm waging a war within myself, a war to find the true me, and I fear that I am losing the battle. So rather than admit defeat, I'm going to beat a quick retreat into the no-man's land of death. As I have only the will and not the fortitude necessary, a friend of mine, seeing how great is my torment, has graciously consented to look after the details. His name is Mack Herring, and I pray that he will not have to suffer for what he is doing for my sake. I take upon myself all blame, for there it lies, on me alone. Betty Williams. It is a competent letter, eloquent and clear. Betty Williams is rational, does not appear to be insane, nor is she equivocal concerning her wishes in the matter. She has given, it seems, Mack Herring permission to end her life. According to Mack, Betty had spoken to him privately in the prop room during rehearsals for the new play that day, and told him again she wanted to die. After this meeting, Betty subsequently told Maguire, "Goodbye, it's been nice knowing you." "What do you mean?" he asked. "I finally talked Mack into killing me," she said. "I'll send roses," he said. It was a joke, of course, wasn't it? But Betty had only 2 days left to live. She wrote at this time, "I am consumed with this burning emptiness and loneliness that has taken charge of me, body and soul. I have to fight it, or else it will pull me down, down into that thankless pit of fear, pain, and agonized loneliness." That was the background to the murder of Betty Williams, a talented, intelligent 17-year-old girl who seemingly had everything to live for. Detectives scratched their heads. Following his confession at Odessa police station, Mack Herring accompanied police officers to the hunting lease 26 miles northwest of Odessa, where he said he had killed Betty Williams. He took them down a dirt track and told them to stop. Down a steep embankment he led them to a stock pond, a watering place for cattle. There was blood spatter and gore, as well as visible footprints at the spot beside the tank, and a pair of muddy boots, Mack's. He told police he had shot Betty here, weighted her body down, and placed it in the pond. They asked Mack to locate the body for them. He stripped to his underpants, waded out towards the middle of the pond, disappeared under the water, and re-emerged, tugging a heavy object, which he dragged to the water's edge. The policemen present saw that it was the body of a young woman, with 2 heavy lead weights attached to it, dressed in baby pink pajamas and a duster. Most of her head was missing. What stunned police officers was how cool Mack Herring was. He told them in a quite matter-of-fact way that he had placed a 12-gauge shotgun against Betty's head, blown a major part of it off, then weighted her down, and had returned home and subsequently gone to school, as if nothing had happened. Now he had dived in to retrieve the monstrously disfigured body of his ex-girlfriend for them. A bemused Deputy Sheriff McAlpine asked him, "Mack, didn't you expect to get caught?" "Not this quick," he replied. "You showed no emotion or regret or fear," recalled the officer. "It was like he was talking about shooting a dog." Reporters got wind of events moving quickly concerning the missing girl, and were hot on the tail of an ambulance called to remove the body of Betty. They arrived at the pond to find police with Mack Herring. For some reason that is difficult to fathom, reporters were given full access to Mack Herring during this period. It was hardly in his own interests or in the interests of justice, but he was loquacious. He told them what had happened. She asked him to kill her on Monday, he said. She asked him again on Tuesday. On Wednesday he left rehearsals for the school play at 8:30 p.m. and went home and fetched his gun. He met Betty in the alley to the rear of her house, and they drove to the spot, north of Odessa. "I had made my mind up before I went to pick her up," he told police. "I'd hoped to talk her out of it, but I knew I could go through with it if I had to." Betty had been happy. She was looking forward to heaven, he said. They sat in the jeep and talked for 15 to 20 minutes, and then they walked to the pond. It was cold. Betty was shivering. She returned briefly to the jeep to fetch her duster. Mack waited for her at the water's edge, a 12-gauge shotgun in his hands. Betty removed her shoes. Mack said to her, "Give me a kiss to remember you by." She did, and said, "Thank you, Mack. I will always remember you for that." She didn't need a terribly long memory. "Now," she said. Mack said he raised the gun barrel to her head. She put her hand up to steady it against her left temple, and he pulled the trigger. She was dead, like that, Mack told reporter Phil Record, snapping his fingers by way of demonstration. Records said he could detect no remorse in Herring, only concern for what would happen to him now. Would he get the electric chair? He told police he had dragged Betty into the water. She sank right away. She had 50 pounds of lead tied to her, he told a stunned Sheriff Bill Eddins. The sheriff later said he had no doubt at all that Mack Herring was sane at the time and fully understood his actions. He could not discern a motive, however, and when asked, Mack simply replied, "There is no motive." Eddins did not accept Mack's story. He said, "There is something missing here. You don't take people out and shoot 'em like rabbits." It was a fair point. He took the view that it was true that Betty had asked Mack to shoot her, but not that she had meant it. It was some kind of extreme game. Meanwhile, the news of Betty's murder and Mack's arrest spread through Odessa that afternoon and evening. People were deeply shocked. Mack was popular, people liked him, yet he was charged with first-degree murder, and a possible death sentence awaited him. On the 23rd of March, the day following his arrest, Mack Herring was bailed in the sum of $10,000. That's about $100,000 in today's money. He returned to his home and also to his social life. He was, incredible though it seems, in demand. He was a celebrity. By his own estimate, he dated 3 or 4 different girls while on bail. The trial of Mack Herring took place 11 months after Betty's death, on the 20th of February 1962. Adolescents, especially young girls, were out in force. Warren Burnett, a suitably young but ferocious Texas lawyer of 34, with an impressive record of defending clients, was counsel for the defense. His argument was, quite possibly the only one available to him, that of temporary insanity. He applied for this matter to be determined by a jury before a full trial could be heard. In other words, the sole question of such a hearing would be, was Mack Herring fit to stand trial? Judge G.C. Olson at District Court decided to allow a pre-trial hearing at which jurors would be invited to determine whether or not Mack Herring was temporarily insane at the time at which he committed the crime. It was a controversial decision by Olson because it did not permit the circumstances of the killing nor of Mack's general mental status to be considered. It was very narrow and specific in focus. It was the first time in Texas that the solitary question of sanity at the time of a murder had been allowed to be considered in this manner. Nevertheless, the objections of the state were overruled, and after a brief deferral, the pre-trial hearing took place at Kermit in Ector County. The courtroom was packed with teenage girls come to see the star of the drama. The rest had turned out to support and sympathize with the young, clean-cut Mack Herring. The grief-stricken parents of Betty Williams were objects of sympathetic curiosity, little more. Betty's father often wept during proceedings, seemed lost. Dan Sullivan and John Banks appeared as joint counsels for the state of Texas. As is normal, both sides of the Atlantic, in cases in which a plea of sanity is made, the burden of proof is reversed. The presumption of sanity is accorded to all. It is for the defense to prove that the defendant is or was insane. First, Betty's letter exonerating Mack of culpability was read by Mack's father to the jury. This was followed by the appearance of 9 character witnesses who all gave their inexpert opinion that the boy must have been temporarily insane at the time he killed Betty. 3 classmates testified that Betty had asked each of them to kill her. A psychiatrist, Dr. Marvin Grice, hired by the defense, had examined Mack some days after the killing and gave it as his opinion that Mack had been dethroned of his reasoning by Betty's requests, and that when he had pulled the trigger, he had indeed been temporarily insane. He became so mixed up and so sick that he felt pulling the trigger was what he should do for her. He was deprived of the power of applying logic. But it was, he assured the jury, a temporary insanity which had passed. He was now quite normal and represented no danger to anyone. From Sullivan's point of view, and that of the state of Texas, he required only to employ an independent psychiatrist, one employed by the state, to refute the defense psychiatrist's assessment. However, this was denied, as the defense now claimed that Mack Herring was fully in possession of his faculties. A psychiatrist could give no retrospective opinion on his condition at the time of the murder. It was too late. From this point on, Sullivan flailed in his attempt to assert the prosecution case that Mack was sane and culpable. The defense psychiatrist had essentially presented the jury with the default position concerning Mack's sanity at the time of the murder. Sullivan argued that jealousy, not insanity, had been the chief emotion guiding Mack Herring at the time of the murder. Betty had parked with Bill Rose while dating Mack, he said, but the defense called Bill Rose, who claimed he had parked at a secluded place with Betty and that he had rejected her sexual advances, and that the incident had little effect on Mack nor on their friendship. The ranks of West Odessa had plainly closed. It was an uphill struggle for Sullivan. He later said the hearing by Olson was a perversion of the law. He was right. None of the facts of the murder or the events were heard in court. Mack was cross-examined, his own attorney deigning to question him in a flourish of bravura. Mack claimed he could not remember, didn't know, and couldn't understand what had happened. He said Betty's pleas to him had a profound effect on him. Now he knew he had done wrong, he said. But when Sullivan asked him if he knew the 10 Commandments, he replied, "Yes, sir, but I still think I was right at the time." It was a curious reply for one whose defense was that he had been momentarily dethroned of his reason. The jury considered the matter of Mack's state of mind at the time of the killing for some 10 hours and 40 minutes. The only substantive and germane testimony was that of the defense-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Grice. They clearly recognized this because, after 4 hours of discussion in the jury room, they asked for his statement to be read to them again. It was, but the request came late on Saturday evening, and first the jury of 8 men and 4 women were recessed by Judge Olson until 9 a.m. on Monday. It meant the Herring family and others had an uncomfortable Sunday. The first vote of the jury was 9-3 in favor of Mack Herring's being insane at the time of the murder. A second vote on Monday morning came to 10-2 in the same disposition. The foreman then informed the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked over the verdict. But Olson insisted they could reach agreement. It was too early, he said, to declare that they were deadlocked. Whoever the 2 remaining intransigents were, they relented. The jury returned after little more discussion. They had now arrived at a verdict. But there was to be another painful delay before that verdict was given. John Banks, joint prosecutor and Winkler County attorney, asked the judge to declare a mistrial on the basis that the judge had no authority to hold a pretrial hearing on the limited matter of the defendant's sanity at the time the murder was committed. Judge Olson refused this appeal. The verdict was then given. It was that Mack Herring had been suffering from temporary insanity on the night of the murder. It was a unanimous decision. Mack Herring was mobbed. He showed emotion at last. His parents hugged him. His attorney, Burnett, joined them in their huddle. Reporters dashed for telephones. Wires buzzed. Newspapers, radio, and television stations sprang into life. Mr. and Mrs. Williams left the court subdued. There was little jubilation for them. Jurors, it had been claimed, knew a great deal about Betty and had a low view of her. Perhaps, but it is doubtful they could have returned a different verdict on the narrow spectrum of culpability with which they were presented. Sullivan and Banks were appalled by Olson's decision to allow a hearing on such a narrow matter, which excluded the circumstances of the crime and depended solely on the question of Mack's sanity at the time of the murder, which of course itself depended overwhelmingly on Dr. Grice's defense-procured opinion. Dan Sullivan took the matter to the Texas Supreme Court, and this ruled in his favor. As Mack Herring had never faced an actual trial, he could not benefit from the rule of double jeopardy, and a new trial was ordered. This was held almost 2 years after the death of Betty Williams in Beaumont, Texas, a considerable distance from Odessa, to obviate as far as possible the dangers of local gossip influencing the course of the trial. Burnett and Sullivan again appeared for defense and state respectively. The trial was somewhat perfunctory. Burnett reeled out classmates, teammates, parents, teachers, and the great and good of Odessa, Texas, for his case. At times it was almost something of a testimonial for Mack Herring. He was an exemplary boy, the brightest, the best, the most decent, the most God-fearing of young men who never cursed. An example to all, admired, good personified, in the words of one of his supporters. It was clearly the result of careful coaching by Burnett, and also of a closing of ranks amongst Mack's friends and associates that produced so uniform an opinion of him, couched in such terms of hyperbole. Burnett dwelt on the absence of motive. Temporary insanity was the only explanation, he said. The jury agreed, and Mack Herring was acquitted. Mobbed, applauded even. The boy from Odessa had made good. There are 2 questions relating to the legal aspects of the case. The first is, was Mack Herring temporarily insane, as the defense claimed? The second is, was he guilty of murder, in spite of the jury's determination at the Beaumont trial? As regards the matter of his temporary insanity, the Texas Odessa prosecutor was right when he called Judge Olson's decision to hold a pretrial hearing on the matter of Mack's sanity alone, devoid of all other details of the crime, as a perversion of justice. It essentially stripped the consideration to the matter of the moment in which Mack acted, because the defense now argued Mack had recovered his sanity. What then was there for the jury to consider? In terms of expert testimony, it was reduced to a single opinion, which was denied alternative expert challenge by Judge Olson's refusal to allow independent evaluation of Mack. That meant Grice's opinion that Mack was temporarily insane, dethroned of reason, as he grandiloquently put it, was the only expert testimony they had on which to base their verdict. It was the only congruent verdict that could be given at the pretrial hearing at Kermit. The Texas Supreme Court was right to overturn Olson's decision. It was contrary to the interests of justice that the matter of Mack's sanity should not be subject to the full consideration of a trial, in which all the circumstances of the murder could be properly taken into consideration. The second question arising in the case is, was the jury at the Beaumont trial correct in finding Mack not guilty by reason of insanity? The answer must surely be no, they were not. There are 2 reasons for this. First, it was premeditated. The preparation Mack had made with regard to arranging to meet Betty at 12 on the night of the murder, his coming home after rehearsals to collect his gun and his cartridges, his procurement of a rope and 2 heavy lead weights, of a miner's helmet even, all indicate this. He had thought it through. He had worked out precisely what he would do to kill Betty, and what he would do afterwards to dispose of and conceal her body. Second, he admitted to shooting her with the loaded gun, to pointing the gun at her head and pulling the trigger, and that his intention in doing this was to cause her death. The premeditation, the act, and the concealment all make this a matter of murder. Was he temporarily insane? No one ascribed to Mack Herring any bouts of insanity or strange conduct at any other time hitherto. No one noticed anything amiss with his behavior on any of the 3 days on which he had been asked by Betty to kill her, nor on the day he had done so. Police officers, the sheriff, and reporters who had interviewed him were astonished only at his coldness, his ability to describe exactly what he had done without empathy, without emotion, without a scintilla of compassion. His sole interest, according to the reporter who interviewed him in jail following his arrest, was in what would happen to him. One expert witness and one expert witness alone declared Mack Herring to have been temporarily insane. That was Dr. Grice, employed by the defense to assert exactly this. And yet his diagnosis is absurd. He claims that Mack Herring was insane only briefly and after Betty had requested he kill her. Now he was quite normal and represented no danger to anyone. Is that possible? Is it believable? Is it consistent with our experience of people, of life? It is not. Mack Herring was not insane. His attorney said he was insane because what other explanation could there be? Of course there are other explanations. The most obvious is that Mack Herring was, in the proper sense of the word, a psychopath. He demonstrated repeatedly to those who interviewed him that he had no feeling for Betty. He described killing her without the slightest remorse or emotion. He appeared to have no sympathy, no capacity for empathy for his victim at any stage in the commission or execution of the crime, nor afterwards. It was extraordinary. The police, the sheriff, the deputy sheriff McAlpine, the reporter Phil Record, all were confounded by this quality Mack possessed. He understood that he had done wrong in the eyes of the law, but he could access no feelings concerning what he was about to do and what he had done. His sole concern was whether or not he would be punished for his actions. That is intelligent, rational, but it is also the act of a psychopath. Mack could not give a reason for his actions. When asked what his motive had been, he simply said, "There is no motive." He didn't have one of any substance. The act of killing another human being may seem to a normal person to be insane, because in a sense it is. It is an act imbued with a certain resolute madness, is far removed from rules human beings live by and all civilized societies insist their members observe. But the vast majority of murders are committed by people who are sane by the standards we lay down for such matters, and the society must judge the generality of its members to be sane because the value and safety of human life depends on this. Mack Herring was coherent before, during, and after the crime. He thought through its concealment. He concealed the body so that it would not be found. He understood that what he did was wrong. He lied and attempted to conceal what he had done to police, again indicating he understood that what he had done was wrong. He expressed concern about what would become of him when he was caught. His thoughts at all times are reasoned, apposite, cogent, directed by intelligent thinking. Mack Herring was sane when he murdered Betty Williams. Did her apparent consent in her letter alter that? Not at all. Culpability for crime is not something we can pass on to others, absolve others of, or something we can share. If 6 men or 60 men commit a murder, it does not imply that they will divide the sentence between them. They are each guilty of murder, and will each be subject to the penalty commensurate with their crime. It is obvious that this must be so. If one person tells another to commit a murder, and they do so, neither is deprived of their individual responsibility in the matter. Both may, all things being equal, receive the penalty for their crime individually. Nor could Betty Williams absolve Mack Herring of responsibility for her death. It was not hers to give. Mack Herring was responsible for his actions, not hers, and vice versa. Even if her intention was unquestionably that he should kill her, it did not alter his position a single jot. He was responsible for his actions. The letter she wrote is irrelevant to that question. The deliberate taking of another person's life, in all but a few specific circumstances, is murder. Mack Herring had confessed to murdering Betty Williams. In the U.S., the crime of murder is neatly divided into murder in the first degree and murder in the second degree. These roughly equate in British law to murder and manslaughter. The first of these, murder 1, is the most serious offence, and in many parts of the US then, as in Britain some decades ago, it carries the ultimate penalty the law can afford, that of death. As Mack Herring had engaged in the premeditated and quite deliberate killing of Betty Williams, by his own admission, the case was one of murder in the first degree. The great question in the case, aside from the legal issues, is that which the more thoughtful of Betty's contemporaries posed. Did Betty really wish to kill herself, or was she motivated by the hope of winning Mack Herring back? Why, in other words, did she ask Mack to kill her, and why did he comply? The answer involves a degree of speculation, but as far as I can fathom, it surely must be something along the following lines. Betty Williams liked attention. She got it in any way she could. She liked to be on stage, the center of attention. She entered a public speaking contest and made it into the top 5. When she was off stage, she sought other means of standing in the limelight. She held outlandish views for someone of her background in 1961. In her personal life, too, she craved attention. She was reported to have gone around without a bra. She parked with too many boys, was known as a girl a boy could get somewhere with. It got her attention. As girls despised her, boys were curious. She was taken with the quiet Mack Herring. She regarded him as different than the other boys. He was attracted to her, but she soon discovered that he was embarrassed to be associated with her. He did not take her to the parties he attended, nor did he bring her home to his parents. Betty thought she could increase his fervour by making him jealous. She parked with Bill Rose, the handsomest boy in the class. That should do it. But it caused a rupture between them, and Mack decided to take up with another girl. Betty regretted it. She said she would do anything to win Mack back. She was determined to win him back. Whatever other efforts she made to attract his attention, they failed. She failed to get a major part in the school play, too. And to make matters worse, Mack did. He was said to be a good actor. When he was 10 years old, he had gained the attention of his teachers for his acting potential. As luck would have it, he was to play a killer, Trocastella, from the play Winterset. In this, he plays a killer who sent a man to the electric chair 20 years earlier for a crime he had committed, and subsequently goes on to kill the man's son and a young woman. And he gets away with it. Betty asked at least 3 other people to kill her, but the only one she persisted with was Mack. He was the real objective here. Asking the others simply provided cover for approaching him. None of those asked, including Mack, took her seriously, as their replies indicate. "I don't think so," laughed one. "I charge for my services," quipped another. Then she asked Mack. He treated it the same way, but in the car, when he was giving her and another boy a lift home, she asked him again. A kind of daring flirtation was in play. She wrote a note and gave it to Mack. There was laughter. None of them took it seriously. Betty was, in the most flirtatious manner, in placing a letter absolving Mack from any responsibility for killing her, putting her life in his hands. It was an act of sacrifice for a loved one. Juliet for Romeo, she could give him no more. When she met him after the rehearsal for the play, the night before the murder, she pressed him again. Mack looked her in the eyes. The joke was tiresome, yet there was for him an intractable eroticism there. "Okay," he said. He had called her bluff. A game had been engaged between them. She tells one boy, "Mack has agreed to shoot me. I'll send roses," he says. But the game has moved a stage further. That is clear when she asks him to meet her at midnight in the alley behind her house, and he agrees. She has a date with Ike Neal, and when, at midnight, Mack appears, her surprise is palpable. "Oh my God," she exclaims, "I didn't think he'd come. I have to call his bluff, even if he kills me." Here is an absolute statement of her intention. She has pushed him thus far in a private duel, but she does not think he will do it. "I have to call his bluff," she says. It is a bluff. She wants to face him down. He is not Trocostella. All his talk of shooting wounded animals north of Odessa is talk, bravura, but she will take him to the point of no return. Even if he kills me. Her intention is to live. The word even expresses the possibility that she may die as an extreme possibility. She is willing to take the matter to the point of resolution. He will back down. She must outbluff him at any cost. Mack Herring is an average student, very quiet, harmless to most, mild in temperament. His greatest passion, which he pursues quite dispassionately, is going up to his father's hunting lease, sometimes for days on end, shooting animals. It is not an unusual pastime, and there is little to suggest that those who indulge in it are prone to murder their fellow beings. But in this occupation, Mack seems to be unusual. Others have noted that Mack does not allow a wounded animal to escape, but is keen to dispatch it. They cite this in his defense as a virtue. It is an admirable trait. Now this is very interesting indeed, because such an attitude is susceptible to two interpretations. One, there is that which friends attribute to it, of not wishing an animal to suffer. And two, there is the possibility that he enjoyed in some manner the act of killing, derived some intense satisfaction from it, the power of standing over a wounded animal, its heart still beating, and bringing it over that threshold to a sudden violent end, without emotion, gave him the power of gods. I see nothing in Mack's personality or actions to suggest he has a certain softness in his nature, which forces him to end a wounded animal's suffering. Think of the fact that he had blown half of a girl's head off without any misgivings. Think of the complete absence in him of regret or emotion on pulling the body of Betty Williams from the pond by her feet, still wearing her pink pajamas. Again and again, reporters and police investigators who spoke to Mack described it as being as if Mack was describing shooting an animal. It was. He knew the stakes were high. The thrill of taking life, a human life, would be for him a unique experience. He has killed many animals. He has played the part of shooting other humans mercilessly in rehearsals of Winterset. There is even a suggestion of this in his statement to police. I knew I could do it. He is curious. He wishes to do it. And after all, Betty has given him carte blanche for this. They drove up to the pond, 26 miles away that night. It must have been around 12:45 a.m. when they got there. It had a certain surreal quality for Betty. She is still bluffing, but puzzled at Mack, trying to read him. He is friendly, calm. She is wondering if he will do it. When they dated last summer, she found him fascinating. He had talked often of killing animals, the feeling it gave him. There is something in his cold, quiet manner that is disturbing, yet she finds it attractive. He is not like other boys. She senses it. Mack is quiet, but his alert eyes are gleaming, betraying his excitement within. They chat in the jeep for a little while until the moment creeps up on them and the bluff takes another step. Mack invites her quietly to walk to the pond. It is as though he has suggested they make love. She is on autopilot. It is quite beyond her to demur, to say she has changed her mind, to admit that she was being overdramatic, to assert herself in any way. The pair are speaking their lines and playing their parts as if they had been set down for them. Mack has acted the part of the ruthless killer Trocostella, a man without conscience. He admires him. He has done this vicariously on stage, and when he shoots an animal, there is something of Trocostella in him now. They walk to the pond. Betty is shaking, cold. There is excitement and fright in her, an excuse for delay. She must fetch her duster from the jeep. She has no need of warmth. She will soon be much colder. But she returns to the jeep. It is the briefest of delays. It has not altered the equation before them a single jot. Mack awaits her at the pond, gun in hand. Their eyes meet. His are steady, something shining with excitement there. What is he thinking? What is going on inside? Suddenly she has no idea. And yet the play continues. It must continue. There is consternation now, because Betty has commenced a game she cannot stop. Still she reads from the unwritten script. She needs a prompt. What comes next? Mack is taken with a lust for killing a person, a feeling he has known many times up here at this place, when he has stood over a wounded animal and seen its glassy eye unblinking, its panting body and quivering nose, and pointed his gun at it, and then pulled his unerring trigger and watched its life end in the briefest moment. Just like that, as he put it, snapping his fingers. "Give me a kiss to remember you by," he says. It is a line from a play. He delays the moment to savour it. She kisses him. They stand there, he gun in hand, and she floating somewhere far off. Now, she says, she is dazed with fear, with incomprehension. He raises his gun to her head. His eyes are unflinchingly on hers. She raises her hand to the barrel of the shotgun, touches it with the back of her hand, feels it cold against her left temple. Mack does not flinch. She is a frightened, shivering rabbit before him. He has pulled the trigger of this gun hundreds of times. Like Trocastella, he has no feelings. He is a killer, ruthless by design. Betty Williams stands before him, a pathetic, frightened animal. He has no feeling for her at all. There is a deafening explosion, the hard blast of a 12-gauge shotgun, a thump in the head, and a falling figure before him. Splintered head and inevitable gore, smoke drifting up towards him, the smell of burnt powder on the air. She is dead, just like that. There is a moment of power and triumph surging within him, and then he exhales, a slow, measured breath as he lowers the gun. No more than a rabbit. The gun still smoking, the cold blue barrels now warm. He walks to the jeep and puts his gun away. He returns to the body with rope and 2 heavy lead weights. It is enough. He ties these about her waist, his headlamp raking her pink pajamas, occasionally illuminating the remains of her face, which distracts him to a pitiless wonder. At last he is satisfied the weights are secure. He strips and drags the body by its roped feet into the water. It is cold. He is shivering now, and with a certain intoxication of mood. He wades out into the middle of the pond, the water chest high, and here he leaves the body on the water's bed and returns to shore. It is cold. He returns to the jeep and puts the heater on to warm himself. His teeth are chattering as he dresses, but he is dismayed to see that his boots are muddy from the water's edge. Mack is fastidious about his jeep and will not sully his carpet and trim. He decides to leave his boots beside the pond. Later he will worry about this. Mack Herring drove back to Odessa. He crept into the house and went to bed. He lay awake, reliving the drama, knowing that Betty lay cold and dead on the bed of the stock pond, with half of her head missing, while across town her parents and sisters and brother slept oblivious to the terrible fright which awaited them. In the morning he was up for breakfast. Everything was normal, and he went off to school, chatted with his friends about the play, about football, but not about Betty. This may not be exactly as it happened, of course, but I believe it is close enough. As much of an approximation as we can get to what goes on in the minds of 2 people locked into a powerful duel of wills, a game of chicken, in which fantasy, desire, and a certain stubborn resolution play their part. West Odessa didn't desert Mack Herring. He remained popular amongst his friends and classmates. The ire of the right kind of people was transferred to Betty Williams. It often is. She was seen as a slut and a manipulator who had tricked the boy into killing her. Her cousin, Shelton Williams, who wrote a book on the subject, said, "People took the view that if Betty did not exactly deserve her fate, then she had provoked Mack into killing her." Betty's family lived with the shame and stigma of their daughter's end, her reputation sullied, largely by herself, but mercilessly promoted by many of her peers from the right side of town. As far as we know, Mack Herring never showed remorse or sorrow for what he did. It was beyond him. Any regrets he had would doubtless have been about how the events of 1961 had changed his life, caused people to look twice at him in the street, or shop, or wherever he encountered others. A certain curiosity. Mack Herring went to Texas Technical University after he left Odessa High School, was something of a celebrity there, but the thin, polished gilt wore off after a time. He worked variously as a welder, a carpenter, and an electrician. He married twice and divorced twice, and lived in a down-at-heel house, was always quiet, something unfathomable about him, and was, by all accounts, unremarkable. John Mack Herring lived the rest of his life in Odessa, Texas, where he was born. He died on the 5th of January 2019, at the age of 75.